Welcome back, everybody. For today's deep dive, we're going back in time,
Back in time
but
to past.
not exactly. We're going back to some of the most famous historical myths
Oh, okay.
and debunking them
I like it.
using real evidence.
Sounds fun.
So, you might be surprised to learn that some of the things you think you know about history just aren't true.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of myths out there.
Right. So to kick things off,
Okay.
let's talk about a phrase that's like synonymous with royal indifference.
Okay.
Let them eat cake.
Hi, yes.
It's the ultimate symbol of a detached monarch.
Right, a monarch totally out of touch with their people.
Yeah, supposedly uttered by Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution.
Right.
Makes for a pretty dramatic story.
It does, but the reality is a lot less exciting.
Oh,
There's actually no evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said those words.
really?
Yeah, the phrase actually appears in a book.
A book?
Yeah, a book written years before Marie Antoinette was even born.
So this infamous quote is completely made up. But it's so well known. Why has this myth persisted for so long?
I think it's a powerful story. It taps into our fascination with the excesses of the French monarchy
Yeah.
and the events that led to the revolution. It's easy to imagine a queen,
Surrounded by luxury.
right, surrounded by luxury and completely dismissing the plight of her starving people.
Yeah, with such callous indifference.
Exactly.
It's almost too perfect a story, even if it's false.
Right. And that's what makes these myths so interesting.
Okay.
They reveal more about our own perceptions of history than about the actual events themselves.
It's like a reminder to our listeners
Yeah.
to be cautious of those historical narratives
Yeah.
that seem a little too convenient.
A little too good to be true.
Exactly.
Okay.
Especially when they reinforce existing biases or stereotypes.
Absolutely. Which brings us to another myth
Okay.
that's often used to kind of explain away a powerful figure.
Right.
The idea that Napoleon Bonaparte was short.
The Napoleon complex? Oh, yeah, I've heard that one. So was Napoleon actually short for his time?
He wasn't a giant, but he was actually average height for a Frenchman in the late 18th century.
Interesting. So where did this myth come from?
Well, likely from a few things. Different measuring systems, for one,
Hey.
and then also British propaganda.
Oh, of course. They love to portray him as a tiny, angry man.
Exactly. They wanted to make him seem less intimidating.
So yet again, we see how history can be manipulated.
Yes, to serve an agenda.
Makes you wonder what else about Napoleon's image might have been twisted over time.
It's a great question, and it's something that historians still think about today.
It just shows the importance of really looking at the source of the information.
Right, and considering the potential biases at play, especially with visual representations.
Those can be incredibly persuasive even if they're not accurate.
Absolutely. It's like a reminder to be savvy consumers of history.
Right. Not just accepting everything we see or hear at face value.
Exactly. Now, speaking of powerful figures whose reputations have been tarnished by rumors, let's move on to Catherine the Great.
Empress of Russia. This one's a bit more colorful.
It is, and definitely not true.
Oh, I think I know what's coming. The story about Catherine the Great and a horse.
You got it. A totally fabricated tale that has somehow managed to stick around for centuries.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. The truth is, far less exciting.
Oh!
Catherine the Great died of a stroke at 67
In her bed.
in her bed.
But how did that story even get started?
Well, Catherine was known for having a lot of younger lovers.
Right.
And that fact, combined with the general tendency to spread rumors about powerful women.
Yeah. Especially women who defied expectations.
Exactly. That created the perfect environment for this myth to take hold.
It seems like powerful women throughout history have always been the target of these kinds of rumors.
Yes, rumors designed to undermine their authority and tarnish their reputations.
Right. So it's another reminder to be skeptical of those stories that seem designed to shock or titillate.
Yeah, there's often a more nuanced and interesting story beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's stay sharp and keep digging deeper.
Agreed. Now, are you ready for another myth? One that challenges our assumptions about powerful women in history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's hear it. This next one's a little out there.
Out there.
Yeah. The idea that Queen Elizabeth I,
The Virgin Queen.
was actually a man in disguise.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It is,
Right.
but it's surprisingly common.
It is. And it's completely false.
Of course. But why do you think this myth has stuck around for so long?
I think it comes down to the fact that some people just couldn't handle the idea of a woman ruling England.
Back then.
Yeah, Elizabeth challenged all those traditional ideas about gender roles.
And some people just weren't ready for that.
Exactly.
And
So instead of accepting her as a powerful and intelligent ruler,
they made up this wild story.
right, it was easier to believe in a conspiracy than to accept that a woman could be a great leader.
That's pretty messed up.
It is. And it shows how prejudice can really distort our understanding of history.
Absolutely. We often overlook or downplay the accomplishments of amazing women.
It's true. And you know what's even crazier?
What's that?
This myth was actually popularized in part by Bram Stoker,
Bram Stoker, the Dracula guy.
the one and only. He wrote a whole book about famous imposters.
Huh. You'd think a horror writer would know better than to spread false stories.
You'd think. But it just goes to show that even fictional stories can shape how we see history.
Right, so it's important to be critical of all our sources of information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even those that seem more entertaining than factual.
Okay, so let's move on to a myth that's full of both tragedy and hope.
Okay.
The story of the lost Dauphin of France,
Ah, yes. Louis Charles,
the young son of Marie Antoinette.
imprisoned during the French Revolution.
Right, and the story goes that he managed to escape and live a secret life.
It's a captivating story.
It is. The idea of this innocent child escaping the horrors of the revolution.
And reclaiming his throne?
Yeah, it's like something out of a movie.
It is. But sadly, DNA evidence has shown that the child who died in prison
Was Louis Charles.
was indeed Louis Charles.
So no daring escape. No secret life.
I'm afraid not. The reality is much more tragic.
It is. But why do you think so many people believed he survived?
I think because the French Revolution was such a chaotic and scary time.
People needed something to hope for.
Exactly. The myth of the lost Dauphin gave them that hope,
It's like we said before. Sometimes we prefer comforting stories.
even if they're not true.
Yeah, even when the truth is much harder to face.
But what's really interesting about this myth
What is it?
is all the imposters who came forward claiming to be the lost prince.
Really? People actually pretended to be him.
Oh, yeah. Countless individuals, each with their own elaborate story of escape and survival.
Wow. Some must have been pretty convincing.
Some even gained quite a following.
So the myth just kept growing.
Exactly. It shows how powerful a story can be,
And how much we crave something to believe in.
even in the face of evidence to the contrary.
Before we get to our last myth,
Okay.
what are your thoughts on the stories we've talked about so far?
I think it's amazing how these myths, even though they're false,
They tell us something about ourselves.
they do. They reveal our desire for simple explanations, our tendency to believe propaganda.
Our need for something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. These stories are a window into the human psyche.
They're not just historical oddities.
They're reflections of our hopes and fears and biases.
Right. And by understanding these myths,
Why?
we can understand ourselves better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, are you ready for one last myth?
Bring it on.
This one might make you question everything you've ever seen in a museum.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Now you've got to tell me more. Yeah, those medieval torture devices.
The stuff of nightmares?
Exactly. The Iron Maiden, the Pair of Anguish.
Gruesome stuff.
They really capture that image of the Middle Ages as this brutal time.
Right. But the truth is that a lot of those devices...
They weren't real. Well, torture definitely existed in the Middle Ages,
Right.
but many of the devices we picture,
weren't actually used.
yeah, they were actually created centuries later
Wow.
for torture museums.
You're kidding? So those scary contraptions I saw in the museum as a kid, probably fakes.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
kind of funny,
It is.
but also disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, why would anyone go through the effort of making those things?
That's a good question. Why fake these gruesome torture devices?
I think it taps into our fascination with the dark side of history.
Okay.
We tend to think of the past as more brutal than it might have actually been.
And these fake torture devices kind of reinforce that idea.
Exactly. It's like a historical horror show.
Meant to entertain more than educate.
Right. So it's a good reminder to be skeptical.
Even when we're in a museum.
Absolutely. Just because
Yeah.
it's on display doesn't make it true.
So question everything.
Always.
Well, we've definitely learned a lot today.
We have
From royal gossip and political spin,
to fake torture devices.
and distorted views of historical figures.
It's clear that history is way more complex than we often think.
Yeah, it's not just dates and names.
It's about understanding the past and how it shapes our present.
So before we wrap up this deep dive into historical myths,
Okay.
any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah. Don't be afraid to question what you think you know about history.
It's good advice.
Explore different perspectives. Be open to new ideas.
And remember, the truth might be even more interesting than the myth.
Exactly.
That's a great point. So to all our listeners out there,
Yeah.
what historical myths have you always wondered about?
What stories have you accepted as truth without really looking at the evidence?
We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop digging deeper into the past.
And if you enjoyed today's deep dive,
Be sure to subscribe for more.
more fascinating explorations of history and beyond,
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
and those history books open.